It's a great pleasure to share our work with you. So the aim of this talk is to introduce you to our work on control of rifted margin structure by basin inheritance. And the case study is the Campos Basin in Brazil. And this work is developed with many people, among professors and students named here. Okay, so this research was guided by some key questions, as for example, how margin architecture varies along strike, how it is controlled by geological inheritance, and what was the role of magmatism and its evolution, and what is the composition of the crust. And this last question is very important because depending on the composition of the crust, as we could very well see in the last two presentations, excellent presentations, this crust will behave differently under the forces, for example, during the rifting. So we know that the Brazilian basins are very different along the margin. Here we see Campos Basin and Santos Basin on the lower picture, but we know that they are different in terms of structuration, magma budget, and deposition, but we have very little knowledge about the nature of the crust. So this is the southeastern Brazilian margin. We are here in the world. We can see Santos Basin in the south, Campos Basin in the north, and then Espírito Santo. This is the common ocean boundary here. I will focus on Campos Basin in this presentation. And we can see from this image that Santos Basin is very, very wide. It's the largest basin in the Brazilian margin. Campos Basin is narrower, and Espírito Santo is much narrower. And to the north, the basins are very narrow. So these white circles show places that wells drilled basalts in these locations here. These are dike swarms that were in place during the beginning of the rifting process. So in order to understand the margin architecture and why it has such architecture, we need to take a glimpse into the geology of the basin here. So here we see the geological terrains that compose this continental crust here. We see the Ribeira Belt here in this region, and here we see the Araçuí Belt. And the easternmost part of Ribeira Belt is this terrain here, which is called the Cabo Frio tectonic domain. So these are the terrains that may make the basement of these basins, of course, deformed during rifting. These blue circles indicate places that basement was drilled here and here. This is the Cabo Frio high area. So this small terrain here is very different from the rest of the Ribeira Belt, as I will show you. This is the Cabo Frio tectonic domain. It's constituted by Neoproterozoic to Cambrian nappes and a Paleoproterozoic basement, gneissic basement with some amphibolites. And the Araçuí Belt is a more massive and unstructured crust from a post-collisional Cambrian-Ordovician magmatic province. So what are the pre-rift conditions? Here we see the reconstruction of Gondwana. In blue, we see the path of the rift from south to north, and it was deflected midway by the Ediacaran orogenic belts here. Here we have the San Francisco Craton and the conjugate Congo Craton in Africa. So these orogenic belts here influenced greatly the formation of this margin. And right here in Santos and Campos, the rift was deflected. In this image, also reconstructed, we see the Cabo Frio tectonic domain in purple here, the same color than the African terrains here because they share geochemical and petrological similarities here. This star shows where the basement was drilled and the margin today, and with rocks from the Cabo Frio tectonic domain. They were dated in 1.9 billion years ago. So the basement of Campos Basin is constituted by this terrain and part of the Arasui belt, as I will show you. So this is how the rocks look like in this area. We see here paragnesis and Paleoproterozoic basement interleaved with some amphibolites. It's a very high strain area. This is me trying to understand this basement here in the field. Here we see the contact between the Paleoproterozoic orthognesis and the Neoproterozoic paragnesis. And these rocks were part of a marine basin here that underwent subduction around this age and later collision. So they underwent very high-grade metamorphism. These generated compressive, low-angle tectonic structures seen here. And this terrain here is oriented northwest and north-south. And this is important because this is orthogonal to the rest of the Ribeira belt here on this side. And this influenced the propagation of the rift. So at the onset of rifting, South America plate rotated clockwise here, and this progressive rotation created first northwest southeast extension, and then later in the middle of the rift stage a more east-west extension. And this resulted in northeast, southwest main rift structures, but they are segmented by east-west and northwest transfer zones and other transfer structures. So we can see from what I said before that these structures are not parallel or subparallel to the continental terrain that we saw here. They are in fact orthogonal. Along with these tectonics, we have magmatism and this margin. At the continental area, we see dike swarms. Here we see an example. And at the basin, we have flood basalts here in this area. This is represented by this green layer here. These flood basalts cover the crystalline basin in some regions of Santos Campos and Espírito Santo Basin. They are pre-tectonic relative to the rift sequence here, and here we see the side sequence, the base of the salt and the drift sequence. So this rift was accompanied by magmatism since 140 million years ago to 114 million years ago. So recurrent magmatism. Okay, so our results are mainly based on analysis of magnetic and seismic data. So here I show you the magnetic map. Magnetic anomalies, for those who are not familiar with this technique, it's very useful to map distribution of magmatism because igneous rocks, mafic igneous rocks, and especially volcanic rocks, are some of the main carriers of magnetic minerals. So they have a very high magnetic response. So we use magnetic anomalies and seismic to map the domains, marginal domains of this basin. We see here from these colored stripes here. So here we have the proximal domain, the necking domain, and the hyperextended domain. This is the continental ocean boundary here. And we see that from south to north, the pattern of the anomalies is very variable. And this southern part, the proximal domain, is characterized by important magnetic anomalies and magmatism, confirmed by drilling wells, while the necking and hyperextended domain is devoid of important magmatism. The central part of basin is more characterized by magmatism in its necking domain, not in the proximal and not in the hyperextended except near the continental ocean boundary. And the northern part of the basin is characterized by magmatism only approaching the breakup. So we see that also these domains change width across the basin here. In the southern part, we have the largest width of the margin. and the central part is very large as well, but a little bit less than the southern part. And the northern part, we have a very narrow rift, and the necking domain varies a lot as well. But the hyperextended domain seems to remain almost invariable along the basin. So one important observation from this is that the magmatic budget seems to be inversely related to rift width in this case. In this residual map from the magnetic anomalies, we see this anomaly here, this blue area here, which was interpreted by Alves as the Campos inflected anomaly. We see on this map that the main structural trends in this basin are northeast, southwest, but they are segmented by this anomaly here. And this area corresponds to this very deep depot center on the basin here. So it is coincident with a pre-existing rheological boundary between the Ribeira Belt to the south and the Araçuí Belt to the north, as well as in the African counterpart. It is coincident with the location of this boundary between these two African terrains. So we interpret this in terms of that the rift transfer zones may have nucleated at the pre-existing rheological boundaries. I will show you the crustal architecture from north to south. So in the northern part, we see this crustal architecture. The crust has a very semi-transparent reflection pattern, very massive and fully reflective, except for this lower part here. A very steep crustal necking and narrow margin here. At the central part of Campos, we see, At the central part of Campos, we see this layered crust here with a more massive reflection pattern, semi-transparent in the upper part, in the upper crust, and a very reflective pattern at the middle crust here and here. We see these concave down reflectors here, and they are interrupted by these discontinuities, intracrustal discontinuities, which we interpret in terms of previous thrust faults. This could be an orogenic basement that I will show you here as a possible analog to represent this middle crust here. This paragneissic sequence of supracrustal rocks from the Cabo Frio tectonic domain. A very foliated basement could imprint this kind of reflection pattern. And interesting is that this area of the basin, we have a double necking zone, very wide distribution of the formation here. And the thickest deposits in this area is the main petroleum exploration area of the basin. And between the central and northern part, we see these differences in reflection of this crust. In the southern part, we see central and southern, we see this reflective pattern, very layered crust, while to the north, we see this more massive crust here. And here we see a very strong reflector that may represent shear zones. And the southern part, we see this gradual crustal thinning. Again, a layered crust with upper massive crust and the middle and lower crust very reflective with these concave down reflectors. Taking a closer look, we see these reflectors that may indicate a folded basement of an orogenic belt here. And a good analog to this could be this foliated basement that we observe on land. So we observed important variations from north to south along this basin in key architectural elements: crustal thinning, rift width, amount of deformation, and magmatic activity. So one of the conclusions of this work is that the presence of this middle ductile crust, very reflective crust and seismic, influenced the rifting distributed in the deformation. So in the more southern part of the basin, possibly part of this crust is constituted by the carbon-free tectonic domain. The central part can be the crust of this orogenic belt here as well, but in the northern part of the basin seems that it is constituted by another crust, for example, most possibly the Arasui belt. So inherited geology and magmatism had a dominant effect on the crustal response to deformation, where to the north, more strong and massive crust seems to have localized the deformation, generating a rift that was narrower. While at the central and north and southern part of the basin, the presence of a weak lower crust led to a distributed deformation, creating a wider margin. The hyperextension of the crust seems to be more independent of inherited rheology and maybe more controlled by asymmetric processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natasha. That was a really nice example with some beautiful, beautiful seismic data. In terms of, well, I'll see if anybody has any questions. Let me just check the chat and check nobody's got their hands up just now. I have a question in terms of the distribution of those different rift domains. How much do you think rift obliquity may impact those geometries?
A lot, yes. These lines are quite oblique, especially this southern line here. So yes, we see, you mean the obliquity during the rifting?
Yeah, the actual pulling
related
apart.
To the pre-existing structures?
Kind of the interplay between them. Clearly the
yes.
inheritance is a big deal, but in terms of how things were pulling apart, was it 2D-ish or there was like a 3D component to it?
Yes, absolutely. The obliquity will have two effects of producing an apparent geometry when we look at these lines, because they are oriented very oblique to the extension. And in terms of producing rifting structures, when this rotation of the plate occurred, making the rift become more transparent here. In this area, it produced many transfer zones, so segmenting this rift to the north.
Excellent. Any other questions? Oh, there's a question from Gwen.
Hi, Gwen.
Hey, really nice talk, thanks. I have a question regarding your seismic lines. When you go through your seismics from the north to the south, yeah, you can show the one with the 3 lines. You do observe that change in the basement facies that you interpret as that presence of the middle ductile layer. But actually, you don't really observe or map a change in the structures that you are using to thin the crust on top of that. So you do not see any new structure appearing when you are moving southward that could be associated with that layer?
In fact, we do see, now that we are using 3D seismic data, we see better the structures. You mean these normal faults here? The architecture and the geometry of these faults, you mean?
Because these ones are rather standard normal faults, brittle type of deformation. Would you see an evolution of these geometries moving southward associated with that layer that is coming into the system?
We see, yes, we do see that. And especially see here, we see also detachment faults. So when we move from the proximal domain to the necking zone and distal domain, we see some possibly detachment faults here, very highly tilted blocks in this area. And then we see this very deep deposit, which we do not observe in the south. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, yeah, this is what I would expect to see, that yeah, the more ductile material you have to deal in your crust, yeah, the easier is to develop that kind of structure, larger scale and potentially ductile, core complexes type and that kind of things.
Yes.
No, yes, that's interesting.
I think we are seeing core complex structures, yes, in this area here. So this is the work of Priscilla Alvarez, PhD student that is working with us. So she's, and she will work with you. So she is studying these possibly core complex structures. Yes.
Oh, it's very interesting. Yeah, very, very promising.
Thank you.
So there's also a question from Sasha and one from Leanne Strogi. So in classic tradition, I'm going to punt Sasha's till after Leanne's because she's not an organizer. Leanne, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you for doing that. I hope this is a quick question. I'm just wondering about the three domains, the proximal and hyperextended, the other domains, if they developed at the same time or if they developed over time. So I'm wondering if the magmatism was localized in time as well as space. Thank you. This was a great talk. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, this is a very good question. So we believe that the magmatism, we have some drilling to support this hypothesis. We believe that the magmatism varies in time and space along strike. So in the southern part, the magmatism was mainly present in the beginning of the rift. We have many dike storms in this area exactly in the same direction of this large structure here. And when rift moved from south to north, it affects this area. So maybe this magmatism is contemporaneous to this one. So here it is, but here it is in the necking domain because rift was moving from south to north. And this margin here did not have magmatic additions in this initial, the beginning of the rift, and it was only affected by magmatism in the end. So this opposite behavior is very interesting because sometimes we think that the mantle here produced these basalts in the beginning of the rift, and then maybe it could not produce in the later stage of the rift, but in the northern part, it did not produce in the beginning, and then at the later stages of the rift and the breakup, the continental, the oceanic crust is thicker than to the south, and we have this volcanic high here approaching the breakup. So I hope I answered.
And Sasha, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, it's a quick one. Thanks. So the long strike variations that you show here in the necking domain, you interpret them in terms of the strength of the crust. And I would like to challenge that a bit, because if you have, for instance, rift migration, then you would expect a long strike changes that are not related to crustal strength, but just to the amount that the rift is migrating. And this could be just addressed or investigated by comparing these structures to the opposite side on the African margin. Did you envision such a comparison and how these structures vary along strike on the other side?
We are working on this, trying to get more data and observations on the African side. But for instance, if this rift migrating from south to north, if it encounters a more resistant crust, a more resistant rheology, it will probably deflect and migrate to the east, and then produce result in segmentation. And this is really what we observe, especially in this area here. So don't you think that this could be the reason for this change in architecture? If you could model this crust, what would you say?
Yeah, this could be one reason, but there could be several other reasons. And there's not much time to discuss this here, but in 3D models, we see that there can be along strike variations, even though there are no rheological variations in along strike.
Yes, yes, it's true. And magmatism, I think that had a very important role in this, because as Stella showed in her presentation, and Manuel also mentioned later, where if you have warmer mantle in the beginning of the rift in the south, as it's supposed by the amount of magmatism that we observe in this area, it could have facilitated extension. And in the northern part, we do not see evidences of magmatism at the beginning of the rift, so it was not favored by did not favor extension. So